Hello again. I hope you enjoyed that video. That is a beautiful illustration of the fact that sheep will hear their shepherd's voice and respond to the shepherd's voice and no others. And I've looked at a lot of videos to illustrate that, and that's one of the very best that I've found. Our passage today, our message is called The Good Shepherd's Voice. And the passage that the message is drawn from is a very familiar passage in John's Gospel, John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. And I did send everyone the handouts, so if you'd like, you can follow along with those and or with your own translation of the Bible. But in John 10, verses 1 through 10, in this familiar passage, Jesus is teaching, and he is addressing the Pharisees. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. We saw that illustrated clearly in that video. You notice that the minute they hear his voice, their heads pop up from their grazing. He has their attention from the first sound that he makes. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out, find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Most of us are of an age that we remember the world before cell phones and headphones had the tendency to block out all the sound around us, and even the sound of friends together and family. Most of us can remember our parents calling us in for supper. This video link that I sent yesterday, I hope that you got a chance to watch it and to enjoy it. It's a song that my dad used to sing. He loved Jim Reeves, and he used to, when he's playing his guitar and usually in a more melancholy mood, he would sing that song, come home, it's supper time. The world was a bit quieter back then, and it certainly seemed safer. Kids played outside regardless of the weather. But you know, if you heard your dad's whistle or your mom yell, supper, playtime was done for the day. In most neighborhoods, lots of moms would yell, supper time, supper. Playtime was ending in households throughout most communities at this time of day. In most neighborhoods, lots of whistles and yells could be heard in the neighborhood, but you knew which one was for you. It's funny because my son, who's 44 now, kids me about the whistle that I developed for him, because it was a soft whistle, but he could hear it anywhere, and usually after the second time he didn't ignore it. But it was not loud, it was just really soft, and he would recognize it wherever we were. And it's the same way when we would hear our moms and dads or whoever it is calling us, we would recognize the voice and recognize what it meant for us. And we could even tell by the sound of that signal whether we needed to run home or if we could take our time slowly and walk home. In the villages where Jesus grew up and where he did his ministry, sheep knew their shepherd's voice as well. They came when they were called. At certain times of the day in those villages, and even today, you could hear those calls going back and forth like moms calling their kids home for dinner time. And the lambs would all come running. There wasn't anything magical about this. It was something everyone was familiar with. And it was a highly practical and necessary part of life. And Jesus used, as he often did, what was an ordinary everyday occurrence to make the point that his sheep knew his voice. He says that we will know his voice. We will know what he sounds like, and we will be drawn to him. That's the emotional center of these words. Jesus is the good shepherd. We will hear him and follow him. This is a silly example, but I often think of my grandfather, Julian, for whom I was named, and the summers at their farm in Louisiana. And they had a big pasture that went down from the back of the house and went down into a valley below and up the other side. And the back pasture had trees in it where the horses especially would like to go and lay down on hot days. And sometimes you couldn't even see the horses. But there was one old horse, gentle horse, that he let us ride, he let us play with. It was the horse that pulled the sledge when we dragged wood in from the forests, from the woods. It was the old horse that would pull the sledge down the white sand road, hauling us kids. But when he wanted that horse to come, he named the horse Bill, Old Bill, as we knew him. But he would just, it seemed magical to me, but he would walk to the back of the fence and couldn't see what we were looking for. And he would just simply say, do this. Come on, Bill. Not loud. And I'd see old Bill come out of the trees, out of the shade, and walk up. And then as my grandfather would walk along the lane to the mounting stump where we would stand up to get on him, he would just keep that little whistle and Bill would follow him. So when I read what Jesus is teaching us, I know that my grandfather was not the Lord, but I know what it means to hear his voice and to follow him. And that's the emotional center of this whole passage of Jesus teaching. So let's unpack these verses a little and see what it means to be led by the Good Shepherd. First thing we should always do is to consider each story, each vignette in its full context. This is something I emphasize over and over again, because a text without its context is just a pretext. So the first thing we need to do then is to look at the text immediately preceding it, so that we understand what Jesus is saying here. Especially to look at the context immediately preceding this teaching. Keep in mind that the chapter and verse breaks in our Bibles were not there until modern times. So the Gospels had a tendency to be one long story. The Gospel of Matthew is one long story flow. It helps us to have it broken up into chapters and verses, especially for referencing and finding things. But that is, like I said, a construct of our more modern times. They were all one piece until the breaks were introduced later in history. So this section from John was attached to the verses just before, which is telling about the healing of the man born blind. And we studied that passage back in March, on March 21st. Jesus had healed this man on the Sabbath, angering the Israelite leaders and the authorities. It was because he made mud. It's interesting that when Jesus walked through the fields of grain, it was okay to pick some grain to eat on the Sabbath. But if you took it in your hand and rolled it like this to separate the chaff before you ate it, that's called threshing. That's work. So here, when they asked him, how did Jesus do this? He said, well, he spit on the ground and made some mud. There is the cardinal rule broken on the Sabbath, and they completely forgot about the good that he was doing. So they had healed this. Jesus had healed this man on the Sabbath, angering the Israelites authorities. They threw this man out of the synagogue, and which is basic, like being thrown out of the center of your community, your support group. Jesus finds him and identifies himself to this man. So for context, let's go back and read chapter 9, verse 35, and then read a little into chapter 10, just so we can get this story flow, and it makes a lot more sense. Back in verse 35 of chapter 9, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, this man he had healed. And when he found him, which meant obviously Jesus was looking for him, he had been thrown out of the synagogue. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And it's really interesting, the times that Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. There would have been an immediate connection, especially amongst the Jewish leaders, with Daniel 7, which is the first time the Messiah, Israel's Messiah, was portrayed as the Son of Man, presented to the Father, who was crowned with authority and power to reign. So when Jesus called himself the Son of Man, it hearkened back to the Son of Man who rules with power and authority at the right hand of God. But this is not a learned man. The Pharisees and the rulers would have made that connection. But he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? In verse 36, who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you, in language very much like Jesus used in his conversation, the longest recorded conversation of Jesus in the New Testament, was with the Samaritan woman at the well, and he's using the same language. It's the same fulfillment language that he used in Luke 4 when he said, this has been fulfilled this day in your hearing. He says to this man, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and worshipped him. So he had understood, made the connection, and the only response is to worship him. And worship is only due to God. So he is recognizing that this Son of Man is God. Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Verse 39, Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see, and I would put finger quotes around that if you allow me, and those who see will become blind. Verse 40, some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now you claim you can see. Your guilt remains. This passage, this speech of Jesus's, happens just, or this passage in chapter 10 happens just after this conversation with Jesus and the blind man who was healed, and Jesus and the Pharisees. And we have them separated by a chapter break between chapter 9 and 10, but it's all one story, and you lose the flow of the story if it's broken up. Because, see, the recently blind man is standing in the crowd as Jesus speaks in chapter 10, verse 1. And he says, just continuing on, "Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate, is the shepherd of the sheep. A gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out." See how looking at the context and putting it in the proper flow helps us to make sense of this passage. Jesus addresses the Pharisees who are standing around him. They're upset with him for breaking their rules and getting people to question their authority. He heals the blind man literally. And then he discusses the spiritual blindness of these hypocrites who are running their society. He was helping someone blind from birth, a man who was basically helpless in that society. And they were more worried about keeping particular laws for a particular day. They remained blind to the things of God, but claimed that they were the only ones who can see. If we look at a couple of verses in that passage from John, backing up here, if we go back to John 7, this is where the flow of this whole story really began. The rulers of the temple, the chief priests and the Pharisees, had sent out the temple guards to arrest Jesus and bring him in. They came back without Jesus. And so in verse 45 of John 7, we read, "Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, 'Why didn't you bring him in?' 'No one ever spoke the way this man does,' the guards replied. 'You mean he has deceived you also?' So here's this illustration of these rulers and Pharisees believing that they're the only ones who see clearly, the only ones who aren't blind. So they ask, 'You mean he has deceived you also?' The Pharisees retorted. And verse 48, 'Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him?' Claiming sight. They're saying, we haven't believed in him because we can see. We aren't deceived or they'll have the wool pulled over our eyes because we can see. We're not blind. And verse 49, 48, 'Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him?' Verse 49, 'No, but this mob knows nothing of the law. There is a curse on them.'" So through this whole passage, throughout all of the New Testament, we find them claiming to be the only ones who can see, and everyone else are fools, are a mob that knows nothing. Jesus refers to them as blind guides. In at least 3 places in Matthew's gospel, he refers to them as blind guides. And we know that when the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the ditch. But he very specifically called out their blindness the whole time they were claiming that they were the only ones who see clearly, and everyone else around them is blind. But in this story, the blind man was healed because he knew he was blind. Reading in John 9 again and breaking into the story that we just read of his healing, the rulers of the synagogue and the Pharisees called this man in again, verse 24 of John 9. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know. We are the ones in the know. We are the ones who can see. We know that this man is a sinner. I love his reply. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see. And Jesus was saying to these Pharisees, you are blind because you claim you can see. It's a great lesson for all of us. We can't be healed of our own blindness until we can stop insisting that we can see just fine. We can't learn until we admit that perhaps we don't know all the answers, or all of the pat answers that have been with us all of our lives just simply aren't true or not sufficient. It's a matter of having to admit that we're blind to see, having to admit that we don't know in order to be taught. It reminds me of my oldest son, Jeremy. I hope when you meet him, you'll be gracious to him. But he's 44 now. But he was born with a double portion of ego and of self-assuredness. And it was a very interesting child because he actually seemed to believe that he was born knowing things. And I used to try to correct him because everything I would tell him, even when he was young, he'd say, I know. And even things like he thought he wanted to learn to play piano. Or I put it this way. He thought he wanted to play piano. And my wife was a piano teacher. We had a very nice piano. So he sat down for her to begin to teach. And he said, just show me where middle C is. I can figure out the rest. And he was just, I continually had to tell him, Jeremy, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth so you can listen twice as much as you speak. And before you can learn anything, you have to admit you don't know it. And this is kind of the lesson that we're learning that Jesus is teaching them and teaching us through these, well, they're not just stories, these events that occurred. We see Jesus doing this all the way through his ministry, establishing that the Jewish leaders had lost the heart, the point of what these laws were really all about. He also pointed out that these laws and rituals all pointed to something, or actually to someone. That all of these laws, these rituals, everything pointed to Jesus. And all through his ministry, he's realizing that these people have to look again at things they've had with them their whole lives and to realize that, yes, it all adds up to Jesus. Now, if that is the context text, let's look again at this passage in John 10. The word picture Jesus uses here is one they would have been familiar with. It's a communal sheep pen where the animals were kept for the night or for some part of the day. They were, well, actually, they're still in existence in the Middle East and still in use. Some that have been in use for thousands of years. But they were often built against a cave, and then a rock fence was built around the outside of it with large pens with a single door. And there was a watchman, a gatekeeper, who would usually lay across the gate at night and sleep there to watch for them. And everybody would see this in their own minds as he taught. When the shepherds then would report to work, this gatekeeper would open the gate and then he would be able to call the sheep out. He wouldn't go in to get them. He simply would stand outside. And there may be the sheep of 10 different shepherds in any given sheep pen. And all a shepherd had to do was stand outside and call to them. And his sheep would come out because they recognized his voice, just like in that video that we started with. And the people of that day were very familiar with this. And it's good for us to get a picture of things that would have just been daily life for them. A thief and a robber of sheep in that society was especially disliked. It kind of reminds me of the cattle rustlers in the Old West. They were usually dealt with swiftly from the closest tree whenever they were caught, because they were doing damage not only to an individual but usually to a community. So they were especially disliked in that community because they were cutting into the heart of commerce and survival of their community. Sheep meant milk, meat, wool, and were all that stood between sustenance and starvation in many cases. So this kind of theft wasn't just taking a sentimental property or stealing somebody's second car. It cut right into the very heart of the survival of the community. Jesus uses the shepherd imagery that would have been known by his audience. In the Old Testament, God himself is called the shepherd of Israel. He gave the sacred trust to Israel's leaders to be the shepherds of his people. And David, the shepherd king, was the perfect example of the kind of shepherd God wanted for his people. Just to go back in 1 Samuel and read what David, as a probably 17-year-old boy, said to Saul when he didn't want to wear Saul's armor. It's too heavy for him. And Saul was questioning him going up against this giant anyway. And so in 1 Samuel 17, 34 through 37, then David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair." We're talking about a lion or a bear. "Struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." This is the image of the shepherds that God wanted for Israel. This David. Verse 37, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So in this story, the Pharisees' anger was understandable because they understood very acutely what it was that Jesus was saying about them, in sharp contrast to this humble man who had been healed of his blindness. They knew that Jesus was probably referring specifically to a section of Ezekiel chapter 34. In Ezekiel 34 and verses 2 through 6. This is the charge that Jesus, or that God the Father, brings against those who are appointed to be the shepherds and the leaders of Israel. Verse 2 of Ezekiel 34, "Son of man," speaking to Ezekiel in this case, "prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you shepherds of Israel who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock." It's quite an indictment from God himself. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. This passage had to be in their minds as Jesus taught. In verse 5, God continues, so they were scattered because there was no shepherd. That's why Jesus, when he saw the people, he wept, because he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. And these, the Pharisees and the rulers of the synagogue, were the ones who had the sacred trust of being shepherds of Israel. This is why Jesus spoke to them so directly. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered all over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. This is a passage the Pharisees would have been very familiar with. And here is Jesus comparing them to this conviction, this diatribe against the leaders of Israel centuries before. This is not a gentle comparison that Jesus is making. He is saying that they are thieves who have entered the wrong way, that they are thieves who have misled and deceived the people, leading in a wrong direction in order to keep their position of power and their place in society. Even the high priest, when he gave final approval for Jesus to be killed at Passover, said, if we don't, the Romans will come and take away our nation and our place. And this is the same attitude that Jesus is castigating these local leaders, synagogue rulers, and Pharisees for. But in that same passage in Ezekiel, God had promised that Israel's Messiah, the son of David, the shepherd king, would come and be the true good shepherd to his people. In Ezekiel 34 again, continuing on down in the chapter, verses 22 and 23, God says, I will save my flock. They will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. They also had to remember the rest of that passage in Ezekiel. And it ends in verse 31 in our Bible, Ezekiel 34:31, with God saying, you are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture. I am your God, declares the sovereign Lord. What strikes me as I read is not as much the evil of the corrupt leaders, which is apparent. It's not even the lostness of the sheep, it's the goodness of the good shepherd. That in this whole story just reaches our hearts when we realize that he is that son of David who was sent to be the good shepherd to all of us. And it really rings clear and deep when Jesus calls himself, in the verse right after this passage, verse 11, I am the good shepherd. It all connects up. And these Pharisees, these rulers of the synagogue, and the rulers of Israel had to be connecting all this up in their minds. In Ezekiel, the leaders are condemned for neglecting the weak, leaving the sick, not helping the injured. They've allowed the sheep to scatter and left them vulnerable to wild beasts. But the good shepherd reaches out to the broken and the hurting and the imperfect and the marginalized. That's a powerful contrast. Corrupt leaders who will exploit the weak and discard them, and the good shepherd who leaves the 99 to go after and to save the one, or in our modern culture, we might say that he leaves the 1% and goes out to the 99. Sheep aren't exactly the fluffy uh, Sunday school characters that we see pictured. They have a peculiar single-mindedness, even when compared with other farm animals. They, uh, they will follow one another uh, off into rushing water where they're being swept away because they have that mentality. But they also have another peculiarity. If they're put in an area to graze, they will graze it until they have chewed up the ground and chewed the roots and have left nothing but desolation and droppings in an area. And if they're left there, they will do that. Their tendency to overgraze requires that a shepherd move them from pasture to pasture. It continually moves them. I saw this in action, and I think of this most directly when I think about the sheep, the herds of sheep in the Central Valley, up in the San Joaquin Valley, around Visalia, Tulare. They're large pastures of green grass where they let the sheep out and put temporary fences around, and then they have to move them, and you can see the checkerboard pattern as they're moved. I got to know some of the shepherds there. Interesting people, many of them Basque, who still speak their native Basque. They build crude trailers to drag around from place to place, and they sing the old Basque shepherd songs. But you see them out there with the sheep, and the sheep eat and eat and eat, and I think you could take the fences down and they would stay there. The shepherd has to move them by calling them and moving them forward. They won't do that on their own. They're not the smartest animals in the farmyard. And that makes the good shepherd that much more good. A shepherd doesn't necessarily have to be good to his sheep. Even they don't necessarily have anyone watching them. If they're unobserved for much of the time, nobody knows how he treats the sheep. Owners just want their sheep fed and watered. The goodness of the good shepherd tells us about him, about who he is. In John 10, again, reading in verses 2 and 3, we read, "The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep out by name, and he leads them out." It's a beautiful picture. The good shepherd doesn't have to speak with an abusive voice. He doesn't jump over the fence and drive the sheep. He approaches with gentle confidence, knowing that the sheep know his voice. Jesus comes to us with that drawing, gentle voice, a voice that woos us. It's not loud. It's not a driving spirit that we hear in many voices around us. It leads us to ask ourselves, where is that drawing voice in our lives today? When we're faced with a decision or come to a crossroads, are we listening to the gentle drawing voice that's calling us on, that's calling us into wholeness of life? Or do we simply hear the aggressive voices calling us to self-glory, power, greed? Very few of our decisions are entirely that clear cut, but listen closely. What's calling you to be more like Jesus? What voice are you hearing? We find that as we tune ourselves into the gentle voice of the shepherd, he calls us to peace and harmony within ourselves. This healing, this bringing together of all the fragments of ourselves is what the good shepherd is calling us to. He calls us to the shalom of God, the wholeness that only He can give. We are so fragmented, especially in this loud, distracted world in which we lived. People use the term scattered. I'm just scattered. And I know the feeling. But if we take the time to listen, there is a gentle voice calling us to wholeness, calling us to healing and harmony. That's what it sounds like. That is the sound of the shepherd's voice. It's a voice that draws us toward peace. He is the King of glory who reaches out to us to be our Prince of Peace. The voice of the Good Shepherd calls out the very best in us to keep going, to keep loving, to keep singing in a world that is in love with noise. The Good Shepherd knows how all the parts of us fit together and sound together best because He made us. Augustine, one of the early church fathers, wrote, "You made us for yourself, so our hearts are restless until we find our rest in you." Words are so true, and this is what the voice of the Good Shepherd does. He calls us to healing, but we have to be willing to admit when we're blind and where we're blind. We have to be willing to say, Lord, I don't have all the answers, and some of the answers I have don't fit who you are and what you're doing. He's calling us to restore us. That's why in verse 10, the final verse of this passage, we see one of the most important statements of Jesus recorded in John. In verse 10 here of chapter 10, Jesus says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and may have it to the full." He is the life, and He has given to each of us who are in Him, He has given us the life of the age to come. Right here and now, it has invaded this time and space. And that life will never end. He draws us on into the age to come. When He says to give that we might have life and have it to the full, or have it to an abundance, it is that life of the age to come that's already ours. And that's what He calls to in us, and calls us to rest in Him and experience the wholeness that He came to bring us. Does life to the full or life abundantly describe the shepherd you know, the shepherd you're listening to? So often the world associates Jesus with being good or walking the straight and narrow, with some kind of joyless and over serious life. This is the stereotype many unwittingly send out into the world about Jesus and a way of life in Him. It's no wonder they're turned away from it. That's not what Jesus came to bring. He came to give us life abundant that wells up in us and becomes in us a stream, a fountain of water, of life bubbling up in us. All the descriptions of the wholeness He gives us are too wonderful to express, really. So the stereotype that religious people put out into the world needs to be countered by the story of the true Good Shepherd and the sound of His voice. Do we think that the Christian life is really the abundant life? It's not just the key to an eternal life plan or some way to curry favor with the divine, but to live as life was meant to be lived, to live the abundant life. It's to have that full life that comes with living the way God intended. Think of all the tension and stress that would leave the world around us if we followed God's plan for us by following the Good Shepherd wherever he leads. Think of all the homeless people who would be off the streets and the joy and freedom we'd all have if greed didn't take the day in our economy. Think of all the abundance we'd have if we didn't overindulge, and Americans especially have done that for a long time. Think of the harmony if the whole nation, the whole world heard the shepherd's voice. So where is he calling you today? I'm sometimes astounded when I sit down to do study or sit down for a time with the Lord in prayer. And he just astounds me by opening my eyes just a little bit more to see who he is, to see his nearness to me. He moved heaven and earth to be with us and to not leave us to thieves and those who would kill and steal. He came to give us life and to give it abundantly. He's calling you, he's calling me to experience his harmony in our lives and to bring harmony to the world around us. C.S. Lewis, as you well know, is one of my favorite authors. And he was called out of this kind of fragmented emptiness in his academic atheism. And he leaves us with this quote that I think is fitting from his small book, The Weight of Glory. He says, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not strong enough." It would seem that the Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We're half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he just can't imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday by the sea. We're just far too pleased with this world. We settle so often when we're being offered abundance. We sometimes, like stubborn sheep, don't want to move on to where the Lord is leading us because he's always going to be leading us forward. It's always going to be new pastures. But we don't want to leave. We need to just settle ourselves to listen to the voice of the Good Shepherd. And he calls us out of the noise. He calls us out of the addiction to always being right. He calls us out of our status seeking and our backbiting and our comparisons. Let's hear the voice that's always calling us into harmony with the Good Shepherd. I hope that you will just continue to listen to this beautiful song that is playing at the end of this message. It ties in very beautifully, and it is a closing song of worship. May the Lord bless you all and keep you. Check in with me from time to time. Let me know how you're doing, and we will be together soon.